I exploited Willow's weakness, and she hated me for it. I made her marry me when she was at her most vulnerable. She enjoyed my simp-like devotion and cursed me, calling me a shameless, vile man. However, I had an unplanned car accident the day she broke up with me and found a new lover. I changed drastically after that day. That's no longer the case, my friend. Chapter 1. I am a personality inside David's body, and my name is George. This is because the car crash killed the humble simp, leaving behind a madman who bites anyone he encounters. I always emerge when David is at his most vulnerable. I first appeared when David was 8 years old, confined in a tiny, stuffy trunk following his abduction. If the ransom wasn't paid that evening, one of the kidnappers threatened to cut his flesh and boil it for hotpot. I opened my eyes inside his body at that moment. I am calm, strong, and cold-blooded, in contrast to David's timidity and weakness. David was sobbing quietly when I said, "What are you afraid of?" "You have me." He stopped and asked in his mind, Who is talking?" I slowly answered, "It's me. I'm inside your body. You can call me George." He spoke to me every day while we waited for the ransom. I later taught him how to cut through the rope on his hands, and when the kidnappers weren't looking, he stretched his hand out of the trunk and left a clue. He asked, "George, are you the personality split from me? Are you the person I imagined? Do you exist? I'm glad you're here with me, George. With you, I'm not afraid." He was saved and taken home after a bystander called the police. I was on the verge of becoming lost. However, it appeared that no one was home to greet him. For a full week, his father, who was preoccupied with his job, was unaware that he had been abducted, and he naturally never got any ransom letters. David's body trembled uncontrollably as his stepfather laughed and patted him on the back, but his fist was clenched, and he slammed it down hard, grinning, saying, "Oh, David, you've lost weight from all the suffering." His stepmother cried, "It's good that you're back as long as you're safe." Then she turned and said, "Worthless kidnappers, they should have killed him earlier." I stayed because, in his mind, he pleaded with me, "Please don't leave George. Stay with me. I'm scared." We then divided his body. He controlled the body when everything was secure and joyful. It was me when things were hazardous or repulsive. David is not like me. When his cunning stepmother insulted him, I would bluntly and mercilessly respond. David would constantly talk to me inside his body during those times, saying things like, "George, I'm so glad you're here. We'll always be together, okay?" I had read books and knew that in bodies with multiple personalities, they would do whatever it took to erase the other and gain full control of the body. I would threaten his bastard stepbrother with a sharp knife, scraping it just past his temple before savagely dropping it into the wooden doorframe behind him and saying, "Next time, I'll stick it in your eye." I would grab the leader of the bullies at school by the head and force it into the water-filled sink, releasing him only just before he was about to suffocate, saying, "If you mess with me again, I'll drown you." However, David and I were not the same. We were dependent on one another for support, similar to brothers. I promised him, "Okay, we'll always be together," as I gazed into the mirror at our shared face at that moment. David was the one smiling broadly. It resembled a stream that was thawing in the spring and gently flowing over clean, clear pebbles. I believed I would forever preserve his smile at that precise moment. This moment separated me from my soul mission. I'm all he has. Chapter 2. However, others quickly noticed our anomaly. After all, no matter how careful you are, it will always be obvious that someone has two entirely different personalities and temperaments. His stepmother informed David's father that she frequently witnessed David talking to himself. David attempted to kill his father with a knife, according to his stepbrother. A teacher at school told his father that some students said David appeared to be a different person at times being kind and gregarious, and at other times being cold and uncaring. This was a major embarrassment for David's father, who was very conscious of appearance. David's stepmother leaned against the door of the private psychiatric hospital, smiling smugly as she stared at David. He slapped David across the face, causing his mouth to bleed, and yelled angrily, "How could I raise such a lunatic?" The private psychiatric hospital used convulsive electroshock therapy as a form of treatment for David. She said, I personally selected this hospital, David. Don't be afraid. Once you're better, you can come back home." I had to watch as they electrocuted David because I was confined inside his body and unable to leave. David and I tried to deceive them by pretending to be absent, but they consistently caught us. When he was delirious from the shock and foaming at the mouth, they would make him look into a mirror and ask him his name. For 2 full days, they would deny him food, and on the 3rd day, they would present him with enticing chicken legs and beverages, promising that he could eat as long as he erased me. They prevented him from sleeping and alternated between high and cold temperatures in the room. They were torturing him, not helping him. To cooperate and erase me, I told David to give up. Despite his timidity, he managed to find the strength. Hugging his knees tightly, he curled up in the corner of the large, empty room, as if that would help him feel less cold and scared. His teeth clenched until they bled. The shy child who had cried every night since his abduction now stubbornly refused to shed a tear. Ultimately, as he faced death by electrocution that night, I submerged myself in hypnosis. He said, "I won't abandon you, George. I won't let you disappear. We promised we'll never be separated." I told David, "I'm only temporarily leaving you, David. Don't be afraid. Walk forward with courage." I was watching him, and he believed me when I said, "If one day you can't hold on anymore, trust me, I will come back and be with you." I looked at him in pain, unwilling to close my eyes as he sobbed in his anguish and despair. He pleaded with me, "George, don't go. Please, I can endure it. It doesn't hurt really." He made a loud threat that if I left, I would never return. A vow is a vow. I peered inside his body 14 years later on the day he was at his lowest. I couldn't comprehend how someone could be so depressed. It seemed as though the sky and the vast ocean blended together in the dark night sky, with only massive waves crashing one after the other and no horizon in sight. At the bottom of the sea, his heart suffocated and ached. However, I could hear him giggling. At 25, he sat up straight in a sumptuously furnished living room, glowing from the brilliant lights that surrounded him. He was taller now, with a straight back, good features, and a relaxed smile. The beautiful, jewel-encrusted woman in front of him gave him a scornful look. It was quite harsh of her to roll her eyes and say, "What's so special about you? I feel disgusted just looking at you. Go die." Although David's brow furrowed a little, his smile remained unwavering, with his lips curving perfectly. Even after Willow left, he continued to smile and say, "Well, sorry, Willow." His tone was calm and unconcerned, as if he were stating a fact. "No matter how disgusting it is, you'll have to look at this face for the rest of your life." Only after I let out a sigh and said, "David, stop smiling." Inside, his body did he momentarily freeze, his smile gradually fading. I'm not sure how long it took him to gradually smile once more, and I could see the resentment in his eyes. As though the 14 years of being apart had never occurred, he grinned and sighed lightly. I grinned and replied, "I'm here." Chapter 3. David, now 25, is not the David I knew. He called me George. He used to be shy, afraid, and frequently harassed. These days, he never stops grinning. It clings to his face like a mask, each burst of joy carefully calibrated. There's a certain poised ease to everything he does. He described the previous 14 years to me. He claimed to have learned numerous self-preservation techniques in his family's harsh and complex environment. In order to accomplish his own objectives, he discovered how to conceal a dagger behind a warm smile. For instance, he tampered with his stepmother's car when he was 18 after she became pregnant, nearly causing her to die in an automobile accident. Later, he applied a thin coating of olive oil to their home's opulent spiral staircase. Then he stood at the top, watching with icy indifference as his stepmother slipped and fell, one step at a time. "George, did you see the blood beneath her? It was beautiful," he said calmly, grinning. For instance, he hired someone to kidnap his stepbrother's gold-digging girlfriend when he was 19. He then made fun of his stepbrother in the living room for drinking excessively and acting foolishly as a result of the breakup. No one knew who had left the rope on the table, but his furious stepbrother, who had been provoked beyond reason, snatched it up and wrapped it around David's neck. Their busy father returned at that very moment, saw this scene, and became furious. David was gasping and choking at that point, his face flushed red, but when he turned away, nobody saw the smile on his face. David went on to say that the beast was banished and was not even permitted to look at me. "George, you used too gentle a method. This method takes care of everything at once, doesn't it?" Then, when he was 21, he brought home his attractive but weak-willed godsister, who was always looking for ways to get around things. They happened to run into his father by coincidence. His stepmother's popularity plummeted after that. "David, your father said he's going to divorce and marry me," the godsister informed him. She actually listened to him, at least enough to make sure David joined the company smoothly after graduation and took over operations. "Don't worry, I'll listen to you." I said nothing at all while he told me a lot. His tone gradually cooled until he was expressionless, most likely because I didn't answer. He sat quietly in front of the floor-to-ceiling window and said, "George, you're just like Willow. You think I'm a despicable, shameless man, don't you?" I sighed in a calm tone and asked him, "David, you must have suffered a lot all these years being on your own. You must have suffered a lot, right?" I don't usually go for sentimentality, but I couldn't help but feel sorry for him. "I'm glad for you, David," I said with a smile. "Actually, I'm happy you acquired self-defense skills." He was surprised. Then, with an icy tone, I changed the subject and said, "So, tell me, who's causing you pain?" Yes, he is now 25 years old, and I am relieved by how mature he has become. But I haven't forgotten that every time I show up, it means he is in pain. Pain so terrible that he can't handle it. I remembered Willow's disgusted expression as she looked at David and the words, "You make me sick." Go die. I couldn't help but laugh icily and then asked him if he liked her. After all, you only give someone the ability to harm you when you like them. Love can trouble even the heartless 25-year-old David. He has nothing to conceal from me. I saw him gradually lower his defenses, his face displaying sadness, confusion, and a hint of childish bewilderment. Chapter 4. Willow is his fiancée, and they became engaged 3 years ago. He questioned me, George, as to why she does not like me, given that I have been so benevolent and have given her everything. The marriage was for business. Lou's father unexpectedly passed away in a car accident 3 years ago. Willow, the Lou family's only daughter, had to return from her studies in philosophy overseas to manage the fallout and assume leadership of the Lou group. David began taking his father's place at board meetings at that point. Before his meeting with his father, someone informed him, "I've been eyeing the Lou family's foreign trade logistics line for a long time. If it weren't for Martin Lou's accident, I'd never get my hands on this. I heard his daughter is taking over the group. What does that little girl know? She'll be eaten up sooner or later. David, go dig into their details and find out everything you can." This is how David met Willow. However, his situation only changed when he found himself imprisoned in a dimly lit equipment room. "George, you must be wondering why I fell in love with Willow." David paused, then went on. The first time I met Willow was actually when I was 16. After you disappeared, I was tortured for a while before being sent back. Back then I was timid and weak, bullied without knowing how to fight back. All I could do was mentally yell your name, clench my teeth, and endure silently. I comforted myself, telling myself that if I endured, it would pass. His childhood experience of kidnapping caused him to develop claustrophobia. No one heard him yell in the dark as he pounded on the door until his hands swelled. Nobody stepped in to save him. I wasn't there either. Until his racing heart was soothed by Willow's voice, which was light and ethereal like a heavenly melody. When the door opened, he saw her standing there, backlit like a goddess descending from the sky, dragging him out of the muck. She had jokingly said, "Hey, you cry so much you'll never find a wife. Calm down, I'll bring the police over." One of the few pleasant memories he had of his life seemed to be that one. "George, do you know that tiny suffocating trunk has always been the abyss of my nightmares?" he asked me with a faintly nostalgic smile. But when Willow pushed open the door and reached out her hand, saying, "I'm here," I felt like she was traveling through 8 years, pulling 8-year-old me out of that tiny trunk. He then looked for her. She had already left for another country when he eventually learned her name. They didn't get together again until that board meeting many years later. Outside the conference room, David stood looking blankly at the back of the woman seated at the table, her chin resting in her hand as she was deep in thought. He didn't notice her familiar features that brought back memories of that night 9 years ago until she heard the sound and turned to look at him. She smiled and extended her hand to him while sporting Lou's trademark almond eyes and eyebrows. She didn't remember David or that casual act of saving him 9 years prior, so she said, "You must be David, right? I'm Willow, nice to meet you." With their glass facades reflecting the brilliant sunlight, the post-rain skyscrapers outside the conference room rose like bamboo shoots from the earth. David gazed at her intently and grinned slowly as he felt sentimental. He thought, "I have been waiting for you for so long," as he said, "Hello, Willow." "I'm David." He had never said this sentence before, and Willow would never hear him say it. Chapter 5. I said, "But it doesn't seem like your relationship is very harmonious." David sighed and said, "I used the wrong methods, George. My whole environment growing up taught me how to hate someone. No one ever taught me how to treat others kindly. Besides you, no one ever treated me kindly, so I don't understand." This is what he was best at. So, at the beginning, he offered Willow a deal. He became aware of Willow's situation during that board meeting. The directors, executives, and even distant Liu family members are vying for control of the Liu family's empire, each with their interests. However, Willow didn't appear to be as frail as he had assumed. She pressed her lips together in silence during that tumultuous meeting. She appeared to have unintentionally knocked over a glass on the table, while several of the directors were arguing loudly about the unequal distribution of interests. The sharp sound, like a knife cutting through the cacophony, silenced the room. Everyone stopped talking and stared at her. "Why aren't you continuing to argue? I thought none of you cared about your dignity." Willow, 23, furrowed her brows slightly and responded calmly to the stares. Everyone fell silent. Through her eyes, only David, who was seated across from her, smiled. David remained in the now empty meeting room later. He put a fresh glass of water down next to Willow. He said, "Willow, let's make a deal, shall we?" with a faint smile in his eyes. It was a business marriage. David made an alluring but icy proposal to Willow. "Let's get married. I'll help you steady this chair you can't seem to sit in." However, Willow declined after being shocked at first. This rejection didn't upset David. She snorted and said, "Mr. Wang, I'm not willing to trade my marriage. If I ever get married, I want it to be to someone I love, not as a business transaction." He liked her better. He then made multiple subsequent appearances alongside Willow, each time during her most trying times. and each time Willow turned him away with a cold, detached demeanor. Until the last instance, big banks were exerting pressure on the Liu family, putting the company's finances in jeopardy. The rain continued to fall heavily. Willow emerged without an umbrella following her meeting with the banks. David held an umbrella over her head from behind her as she started to get wet. With a sigh, he said, "Willow, my proposal still stands." Willow looked up at him silently from under the umbrella but said nothing. "Why?" Willow asked in a bewildered tone after David added, "You turned me down today, and tomorrow my father will initiate the acquisition of the Liu group." "Why me?" "Because you need me. You need the Wang family, and you know my situation. I have a young stepmother eyeing me and a stepbrother exiled. My father still can have children. The Liu family is in turmoil, and a marriage between us is the least risky and the most profitable. We are a perfect match, aren't we?" David said, turning his head away and lying to her. Willow believed him, and they became engaged. David reasoned that she would never believe him if he told her he liked her and would assume he had a secret agenda. She would only agree if there was a clear benefit exchange. He had to win her over before he could win her love. For instance, he persuaded his father to drop his plan to encroach on the Liu family in the face of tremendous pressure. David told me, "George, you're so dumb, aren't you?" I forced her to agree to the marriage, trying to make her like me, but not wanting her to be grateful to me, so she will never know what I've done for her. Presenting the advantages of the marriage to his father's doubtful eyes was a risky move. Then there was the engagement. When his father put him to the test, he casually responded, "It's just a matter of perspective. How could I like her? Isn't it obvious which is more useful to us, the divided Liu family or the powerful group Dad?" With the Wang family's support, the banks eventually stopped putting pressure on Willow after the news took over the news headlines. Despite her upbringing as a spoiled, wealthy girl, Willow perceived her engagement to David as a slight and a forced humiliation. This deeply hurt her, leading her to maintain a cold and aloof distance from David. But there were times when they were in harmony. They would joke about the cunning old foxes during board meetings, and they had a lot in common. When his stomach ached, Willow would prepare soup for him, and when the weather turned cold, she would remind him to wear warm clothing. Like any other engaged couple, they would eat meals together, go on dates, and take in dance and dramatic performances. Even though there was a slight separation between them, it was more like finishing a task than the intimacy of lovers. Until later. David recounted, "In the first year of our engagement, I went to Liu's to find her. She was talking about a collaboration with Luis from the B group. What I didn't expect was that after the conversation they shared a knowing smile, and then I saw Luis happily hug her. Although he quickly let go, Willow actually blushed and gazed at him with affection. We've been engaged for a year, and she's my fiancée. She won't even let me touch her hand, yet she allowed another man to hug her, and she even looked at him shyly. So I walked in, saw that man smiling at Willow, and told her to stop the collaboration. That's when Willow's funds came from." Willow was in love with David. She questioned David about his insistence on terminating the partnership. "I just don't like him. Why ask for more reasons?" David said in a casual tone. Willow didn't answer, but Luis laughed awkwardly, presumably feeling uneasy himself, and suggested ending the partnership. Willow's eyes went from Luis to David, and she silently gazed at him for a while before grinning at him in jest. They drifted farther apart after that. This time, David was hurt because he had excluded a writer who publicly declared his love for Willow on social media, even though he knew she was his fiancée. The writer had approached Willow, pleading with her to halt Wang Xiao. Willow, though, was unconcerned about this. She just took advantage of the circumstance. Willow questioned whether David truly needed to be so cruel. She called David shameless and vile, making fun of him. When I first opened my eyes inside David's body, I remembered the excruciating pain in his heart. David grinned as he looked at me through the glass reflection, but it was more of a grimace. His face was filled with agony as he asked me, "George, I've never used any of my methods on her. Is it wrong to protect myself? Is it wrong to be proactive when someone is trying to steal my girlfriend? Why is she saying this about me? Did I do something wrong?" he asked. "You're not wrong. You're not incorrect, of course. If someone tells you that you are evil or that you are wrong, then they are incorrect, not you." Chapter 6. Willow is something I hate. I didn't keep this emotion from David. "David, break up with her," I said, with the deliberate nuance of an old-fashioned court advisor, slowly guiding him like a villain plotting against a faithful minister. He simply grinned, his eyes sad, and sighed. "But George, I've liked her for so many years. How could I give up on her?" I said nothing, until we found out that Willow appeared to have fallen in love with someone else. David's birthday was that day. Regardless of Willow's coldness toward David, they were still officially engaged. A few disagreements couldn't separate the entwined interests of the Wong and Liu families, who had been in a business partnership for 3 years. David's tone was calm when he called Willow, as though their argument from a few days ago had never happened. "Willow, do you have time tonight? Let's have dinner." Willow granted his request. This was high society, where people would always act with some decorum and show no signs of emotion, regardless of how implicit their understanding was. The ambiance of the private restaurant that night was lovely, and Willow even gave him a present. I could tell David was truly happy because his smile never wavered. The dinner continued with informal conversation, despite the fact that the tie was a small gift that paled in comparison to the jewelry he had given her. He thanked her sincerely, saying, "Thank you. I really like it." Everything appeared to be going well at this point, but then I realized Willow was acting strangely. She appeared preoccupied. This was a minor matter, but in their world, being distracted, particularly in such a setting, was dangerous. With so many people and eyes on you, coffee was something you could never let go of. You had to be as accurate as a well-tuned machine to ensure there were no errors or slip-ups. Willow, however, had fallen asleep. Before she regained her composure, David asked her a question twice. "Sorry, I didn't hear that clearly. Could you say it again?" David calmly and unflappably repeated, "Next Sunday, my dad has invited us to the daughter of the president of Citigroup's birthday party. Will you go?" Willow hesitated for a moment before responding. "Sorry, I have plans next week." David nodded, picked up his tea to cover his face, and when he put the cup down, his smile had returned. He casually shifted the topic as though it were completely irrelevant. We sat in the car after supper. After a long period of silence, he said, "George, she's troubled." I nodded. "Call the private detective and have them follow Willow." The pricey private investigators got to work quickly, and David and I soon discovered what was making Willow uncomfortable. Golden Daily reporter Makoto interviewed Willow 2 months ago. Makoto had interviewed her. David and I looked through the pictures. Willow, who is usually poised and elegant, was wearing a simple white dress and looked lovely and pure as she walked hand in hand with Makoto on a shaded path. Even with a cup of milk tea in their hands, they appeared to be the ideal couple. David's hand gently stroked Willow's cheek in the pictures, and his fingertip lightly touched the corner of her lips. He asked me, "George, do you think Willow really likes him?" in a low, helpless voice that seemed to be from years ago. I sneered, "We'll find out soon enough." I went up to Willow. She didn't even realize David and I were different. "Willow, last week my friend saw you go to a movie with a man. Even though we have a business engagement, I expect loyalty from you. At the very least, don't embarrass me in front of people we know." I smiled as I sat in front of her. Willow paused, her voice casual, her face emotionless, and her demeanor carefree. I grinned and remained silent when she said softly, "It's nothing. It's just part of our publicity stunt." Newspapers published pictures of her boarding the vehicle of another writer a few days later. David and I scoffed at the pictures in the paper. I told him, "Looks like true love using these business tactics to divert attention." David picked up a private investigator's photo and put down the newspaper without saying anything. Makoto had his head down and was kissing Willow's forehead beneath a blooming wisteria tree in a Zone C park. You could sense the sanctity and purity of their love, untarnished by any impurity, even through the picture. How lovely. She refused to let David kiss her, not even in front of the press, despite the fact that they were engaged for 3 years. I glanced at David, who was still gazing at the picture with a chilly expression. If I were Willow, I would use this picture to bargain with Willow for the Liu family's shares and end the engagement, discarding her. I told David, forget it, forget her, she is not worth it. However, this is straightforward when one possesses only cold, strategic thinking and lacks empathy for her. David, however, cherished her. He grumbled and said, "No one can betray me, George. I'll make them pay. It doesn't matter if she doesn't like me. I don't care. George, I've figured it out. I just want her. Even if she doesn't like me, she'll stay with me for the rest of her life. Unless one day I decide I don't want her anymore." Willow described David as an evil individual. David grinned, but it was impossible to read what his smile meant. Chapter 7. The following day, David was the same David I knew, polite, immaculately dressed, and acting with grace and without any sign of losing control. He said, "Then I'll show her just how despicable I can be." He called Willow and told her about the newspaper interview in a calm tone. In order to keep investors calm, stabilize stock prices, and preserve the board's trust, wealthy individuals occasionally need to publicly portray themselves as a loving couple. They also announced the unwavering alliance between the two families. Willow was silent for a while after receiving the call that day. She paused for a moment before saying, "David, there's something I need to tell you." What could it be? Maybe she was considering ending the engagement. She might have started looking for true love now that things were better and the Liu family was not having as much trouble as they had previously. David's smile caught my attention at the corner of his lips. He grew calmer the more irate he became. His eyes were deep and unfathomable, and his smile grew softer the more out of control he became. I had never seen that side of him before. Willow paused before agreeing when he said, "Let's talk about it after the interview." David was smiling as he sat next to Willow during the well-run interview. Their appearances, coupled with their status as wealthy and influential families, perfectly complemented each other. "How could such a perfect couple exist?" someone asked. David put his arm around Willow's shoulders and, with a hint of affection, talked about their engagement and their past, mentioning how Willow cared for him and how she depended on him. By the end of his lengthy speech, he seemed to have nearly persuaded himself that Willow loved him as much as he said. Willow stayed silent during David's entire speech, probably to avoid contradicting him. David and I didn't look at each other across the crowded room until the interview was over. The dark-faced Makoto was there. That's when David really grinned. David had specifically insisted, when setting up this interview with the editor-in-chief, "There's a reporter named Makoto, right? Make sure he's there for the interview." I didn't answer when he asked, "George, do you think Willow will realize what's happening and call me despicable again?" Apparently unconcerned, he gazed up at the sky before adding, "Whatever she thinks of me now, it doesn't matter anymore." Willow wasn't upset after all. Her tone was composed as she stood in front of David. David looked at her blankly and said, "What if I don't want to?" Willow was perplexed. "You arranged this interview on purpose, which means you already know about Makoto, right? Then let's call off the engagement." David's face went white, his expression momentarily frozen. "Why wouldn't you want to? I'm willing to make concessions with the shares. Our engagement was always a business arrangement, wasn't it?" She never intended to marry him, which is why there had been several delays in the wedding date, he said. From the beginning, you saw this engagement as a business deal. Naturally, the partnership ended when she no longer required this business partner. She had no guilt at all. Indeed, she had made a compromise. Willow went on to say, I agreed to marry you back then just to compromise. Her compromise had been David's sincere devotion. David smiled at Willow's question. David, why are you looking at me like that? You don't love me, and I don't love you. A marriage like this will only cause pain. Willow may have hesitated for a moment, staring at him with a perplexed expression. His smile widened with each sentence she said, and by the time she finished speaking he was beaming with sincere joy. He had previously told me that he didn't want Willow to feel obliged to be with him out of appreciation, so he asked, But Willow, what if I tell you that I'm not indifferent to you? He hoped she would fall for him. He added, One day when she loves me, I'll tell her about our first meeting 12 years ago. I'll tell her I've loved her for 12 years, waited for her for 12 years, and finally she'll love me back. George, doesn't that sound romantic? We'll get married, have 2 children, grow old together, and when I'm too old to walk, we'll sit with our grandchildren and tell them the story of our love. Willow hadn't fallen for him yet, so he had to express his feelings in advance. However, Willow simply scowled in perplexity upon hearing this and uttered, David, I don't remember anything from 12 years ago. David gazed at her, his smile slowly thinning. Willow paused and continued, And I've done some research. David, when you were a teenager, you managed to exile your stepbrother, caused your stepmother's miscarriage and divorce, and even tried to seduce your own father. She sighed and continued, David Wang, young master of the Wang family, you have plenty of schemes. So, betrayal and manipulation in the business world should be something you're used to by now, right? But then, slap! Someone interrupted her speech. I had reached my limit. I gave her a slap across the face. She turned to face me in shock when she saw David in this state for the first time. Willow, you're truly despicable, I said, shaking my hand and making icy eye contact with her. David has countless schemes, yet he never used any of them on you. But from the beginning, you've been scheming against him. He's blind to have fallen for someone like you. I turned and left after saying that. Perhaps she was confused by my use of the third person. She gave me a bewildered, non-understanding look. I didn't want to explain, though. Chapter 8. Inside my body, David stayed silent. Are you hurting? I asked. He had abandoned his one true heart as if it were a worthless object. I asked him if he would have fallen in love with Willow if he hadn't met her when he was 16. He hesitated for a second before answering, no. What could he do? Her timing was just too ideal. It wasn't too early or too late. An ambiguous, ethereal light surrounded her in David's memory. He was obsessed with her, as if she represented an unfulfilled childhood fantasy. His voice was tired and confused, so I sighed and asked him, Can you really not like her? You're too soft on her. It's affecting what I can do. I want to get revenge for you, but I still have to worry about your feelings. I don't know, George. I don't know which way to go. He was disoriented, and only Willow could make him lose his equilibrium in this way. This is not how I wanted to see him. I could only reassure him, saying, I'll always be by your side. It's okay, David. I'm walking with you. I promise never to plot against you or betray you. You can always rely on me because I'm always here, regardless of the weather. I will never abandon you. Willow hurting him more than I thought was possible was unexpected. On the day he disappeared from this body, Willow had scheduled David to accompany her to try on wedding gowns. He went with a glimmer of hope, despite knowing she had no intention of marrying him. A well-known Japanese designer, Yumi Katsura, created the dress, inlaid with 1,000 pearls and an $8 rare platinum diamond, $5 million. He still recalls the well-trained salesperson who gave him the perfect compliments when he and Willow went to order it that day. Miss Liu, Mr. Wang truly loves you. A wedding dress this extravagant is truly rare. However, she would no longer even come to try it on. The assistant's face went white when they got to the store. She stated, Mr. Wang, Miss Liu said she won't come for the fitting. Don't worry, there's still time before the wedding. Girls can be coaxed. David was silent. I believe he was cognizant of the dress's unwearability. It had nothing to do with the dress's poor fit or high cost. The issue stemmed from the woman's initial lack of intention to wear the dress for him. He was struck on the sidewalk by a taxi that ran a red light after he left the store. It wasn't serious. According to the doctor, it was only a minor scrape. The police claimed they could resolve the traffic incident in private because it was so minor. No one took the accident seriously, and the taxi driver, his face flushed with shame, said, Sir, you don't look like someone who's short on cash. I have an elderly parent and young children to take care of. Please don't try to scam me. However, I was aware. From this body, David had vanished. I heard him call my name as he glanced at the taxi before vanishing. Yes, he was extremely exhausted. He said, George, I'm so tired. He had had to struggle to get everything since he was a young boy. It proved to be nothing more than an illusion after all this time. He was worn out. All he wanted was to sleep. Before his eyes closed, I gently took control of his body and said, It's okay, David. If you're tired, just sleep for a bit. Everything will be better when you wake up. I swear. Chapter 9. When I opened my eyes, I overheard Willow speaking with the doctor. The doctor said, We've done a full checkup. Mr. Wang only has minor external injuries, nothing serious. Willow asked, Then why hasn't he woken up yet? The doctor replied, It might be due to the shock. He'll wake up in a little while. Willow responded, Thank you, doctor. After thanking him, she turned around and saw me open my eyes. Her smile faded the moment she saw me wake up, gradually turning into an expressionless face. After a while, she coldly spoke. David, the accident was in the city, and the driver was going only 15 miles per hour. He barely even touched you. Stop pretending. I didn't respond to her. She most likely believed David was attempting to win her back by selling a sob story. At last, I looked up at her as she impatiently asked, David, what exactly do you want? Aloof, uncaring, and cold? I looked at her in confusion, raised an eyebrow, and softly responded, What do I want? Willow, when you and Makoto secretly changed your hearts, wasn't David still your fiancé? Even if you hate him and think he's despicable, can you deny that he never wronged you? When you returned to China at 23 to take over the Liu family, everyone bullied you, wanting to strip Liu family bare. Wasn't it David who threw you the last straw? Over these years, the cooperation between the Wang and Liu families has brought you quite a bit of benefit, hasn't it? Over all this time? Honestly, hasn't David done nothing wrong to you? I paused for a moment, stared directly into her eyes, and smiled, asking each word slowly. Then even if you don't like him, when he was still your fiancé, shouldn't you at least respect him? I know you were forced into this engagement, and from your perspective I wish you the courage to pursue true love. But at the very least, shouldn't you have waited until David agreed to break off the engagement before pursuing your true love? The third-person phrasing seemed to confuse her. I smiled and said, But Willow, if it weren't for David, the entire Liu family would belong to the Wang family now. What would you even have to negotiate with me? She furrowed her brows, and after observing me during my interrogation, finally said, I've already told you, I'm willing to take responsibility for my mistakes. I threw off the covers and got out of bed. I gazed down at her icy, alluring face as I walked by her. Her lashes fluttered slightly as she gazed up at me, her eyes deep and slightly bewildered and disbelieving. I sneered at her and said, Didn't Miss Liu do a background check on me? How come you didn't find out I once stayed at a psychiatric hospital? She grabbed my sleeve as I passed by and asked, You're not David. Who are you? David is dead, Willow. The person standing before you now is another David. Don't you hate him so much? Congratulations, he'll never show up in your world again." She froze for a second. I paid her no attention. I requested that the driver come get me. David's father was eating when I got back to the mansion, and his lovely, harmless godsister was serving him. "Dad, I want to call off the engagement with Willow," I said, looking into David's father's eyes, not because I wanted to, but because I will. The slap across my face didn't surprise me. My mouth tasted faintly of blood, and I could hear my ears buzzing. I wiped the blood from the corner of my mouth and said, "She doesn't like David." David's godsister gasped and clutched his father's arm in an attempt to calm him down, saying, "Hey, let's talk it out. No need to hit." David's father calmly said, "It was you who insisted on marrying her. Now that the Liu family is doing better, you say you no longer want her. David, you won't get away so easily with Willow." "Like," David's father chuckled, oblivious to my word choice. "Didn't she already dislike you when you insisted on a business marriage with her?" he asked in a contemptuous, uncaring tone. I believe my smile would have resembled David's exactly if there had been a mirror. In Chapter 10, I had a direct conversation with Willow saying in a light tone, "But now, I don't like her either." "Willow, we can call off the engagement, but my condition is 49% of the Liu family's shares," I asked in a direct and cold tone, and after a pause she responded icily, "Impossible." I knew she wouldn't agree. She was not a naive romantic. She was unable to give the shares, but she could definitely pay. I had already expected her reaction, so I smiled and said, "It's fine. You can give me the 49% based on the highest point of the last 6 months. Even though it was a huge amount, I knew she could handle it. She would be prepared to pay as long as she could get rid of me." There were a lot of people there on the day we signed the contract, and the attorneys for both parties carefully went over every clause while I sat by the window and observed the passing birds. Willow looked at me and said, "We no longer owe each other anything, right?" when it came time to sign. You'll notice that she avoided mentioning David. She didn't inquire as to why he vanished or if he would return. Her only concern was breaking off contact with me. I sipped my tea, a sensation David had never experienced. He enjoyed coffee and wine, but never tea. Willow's eyes lingered on the cup in my hand for a moment, and I grinned and said, "Of course." I called out to her as we were leaving, and she turned around in confusion. I gave her a David-like smile and said, "Willow, David doesn't love you anymore." Willow didn't answer, but I said, "He loved you for a long time, but I think it's time to tell you he doesn't love you anymore." She looked at me for a moment, her eyes darkening, then she turned and left. I didn't see her again after that. I quickly consented to a press conference to declare the termination of my engagement with Willow after getting the money. I gave the cameras a smile, but it seemed forced, as if I were trying to force it. Liu's stock fluctuated as a result, but it didn't matter because I said, "We've parted on good terms. Our families will continue to cooperate in certain areas, so there's nothing to worry about." When people eventually forgot about this, her stock would increase once more. Although Willow and I weren't famous, it was a hot topic of conversation in our group. People were excitedly speculating at the time about the true cause of our broken engagement. I grinned and remained silent, until someone uploaded images of Makoto and Willow to a thread with the title, "Show us the most well-matched couple in your opinion." The article from the interview between David and Willow, titled "Fairy Tale Romance in the Aristocracy," was attached to the post, which for some reason went viral after someone asked, "Wasn't Willow Wang's fiancée?" The picture featured David grinning indulgently while he had his arm around Willow's shoulder. A skeptic posted a pointed question, saying, "Wait, looking at the timestamp in this photo, isn't Makoto the third party?" Others responded, "I heard they broke off the engagement recently." You see, I told Willow it's okay to pursue true love. However, it's important to pursue true love even after the engagement ends. People reposted the thread on Weibo and Douban, which ultimately led to discussions about the most successful extramarital relationships. Gossip always attracts attention. I was so upset that even acquaintances cautiously sent me links with the words, "David, don't be upset." Despite my tears, I couldn't stop laughing when I saw Liu's stock chart's sharp decline. It is likely that Makoto was also struggling. At the newspaper office, I caught a glimpse of him. His eyes were sunken, his face was gaunt, and his co-workers gave him contemptuous looks. I've heard that his boss subtly suggested that he step down because his actions had seriously harmed the company's reputation. I asked the sleeping David inside me, "David, are you happy?" as I sat in the car, grinning. I got no response. Chapter 11. 3 days later, I got a call from Willow. She was angry. I casually sipped my tea and said, "David, how can you break your word?" "Business is business, Miss Liu. You have a lot of strategies, so betrayal and flattery in the business world should be something you're used to by now, right?" She was shocked. I grinned and had a thought right before I hung up. I grinned broadly and spoke with a steady voice. "By the way, Miss Liu, I haven't congratulated you and Mr. Ito on finally getting together. But there's one thing David never wanted to tell you. But I'm not him, you see. I'm the helpful type. A friendly reminder, Miss Liu. If I were you, before getting involved with Makoto, I'd have someone look into his background. Like his father, who is currently in prison for causing a death in a drunk driving accident 3 years ago. I wonder who he killed." On the other end of the line, there was quiet, followed by deep breathing. I grinned wider, savoring the occasion. When David and I received that picture, we had Makoto thoroughly investigated. I asked, "Do you think your father, if he knew, would come up from underground to confront you if he found out you were in love with the son of the man who killed him? This is good. You won't have to do anything once Willow knows who his father is. These two will break up on their own." I smiled at David at the time, but he held on to the picture with a stunned expression. It was sufficient when he asked me, "Will Willow be extremely heartbroken if she knows?" Consider how long he has been viewed by Willow as the vile, vicious antagonist of the Wang family. Willow described David as despicable. She claimed that since David had money, he should be accustomed to dishonesty and betrayal in the business world. This is the David she views as vile, and despite the way she treated him, he would still ask me, "If Willow knows, she'll be really heartbroken, won't she?" But it makes no difference. David is not me. David worries that she will be heartbroken. I don't. I'm more satisfied when she's in more pain. I kept this a secret until they believed they had conquered everything and won their true love, believing they had vanquished me, the vile villain who stood in their way. I would then strike the last deadly blow. "Willow, go ahead. David and I will always send our best wishes your way. But first, I'll return everything you took from David. I will inflict more pain on you the more you harm him. It's incredibly fulfilling." After David's father suffered a stroke a year later, I completely seized control of his whole business. "Look at you. How did you end up like this?" I sat down in front of him, holding his withered, wrinkled hand, and he sat in a wheelchair with his face tilted, unable to move or speak. He was unable to respond. He simply continued to make unintelligible noises and keep his twisted face. I looked at myself in the mirror that evening. Despite my best efforts to smile, I was unable to locate David's reflection. The image in the mirror was emotionless and icy. Like he used to call me, I repeatedly called out, "David." I informed him that his father was currently in a nursing home after having a stroke. The person in the mirror didn't answer when I finally said, "I've paved the way for you. You'll never be tired again. Why haven't you come back?" It simply stared back at me icily. I let out a sigh. It was spring when David woke up. It was quiet as I said, "David, wake up. The spring is so beautiful. If you miss it, you'll have to wait another year." The air was filled with the warm spring breeze. The breeze blew by softly as I said, "It's okay to be sad about love and heartbreak, but there's a time limit. If you sleep any longer, it'll be rude." I waited in silence for a long time in a room that was empty. I gave a sour laugh and turned to face the stack of papers. I heard a quiet laugh as soon as I opened the first folder. I froze for a second before slowly beginning to smile when he said, "The spring is so beautiful, but I'm stuck with these headache-inducing data, George. I really don't want to look." I replied, "Then let's not look at them. Let's go see the ocean, see the mountains, go to Tibet, and go to Mongolia. If you get tired of those, we can go abroad together. The world is so big, and the scenery is so beautiful. Let's go see it step by step." He was beaming like the first time we met. He was beaming like a stream that slowly flows through clean, clear pebbles. David asked me what I truly was a long time ago, and he said, "Okay." He inquired as to my existence. To tell the truth, neither do I. However, it makes no difference if I'm real or just a product of someone's psychiatric imagination. I am the only source of light in his darkest moments, David once told me. Despite the challenges of life, I have consistently maintained the conviction that suffering and its resolution are interconnected. The remedy is concealed in the suffering if you can persevere and grit your teeth. As one author once remarked, "The heart is like an endless, confusing river stretching for miles. There's no one to ferry you across except yourself. No one else can help you." David asked me what I am. The only thing you can rely on in this world is yourself, so you have to love yourself and never give up. I am him. I am him.